There's a crack running through the ceiling above my kitchen table. Been there for 6 years. Every morning I sit down with my coffee and I look at it, and I think, one of these days I'll fix that. But I never do. Some things you just learn to live around. I want you to know that about me before I tell you the rest of this. I'm a man who learned to live around things. Cracks in the ceiling. A furnace that rattles in January. A marriage that went quiet somewhere around year 22 and never got loud again. I'm 64 years old, and I spent 40 of those years working with my hands, building things for other people that I never quite managed to build for myself. My name is Walter, and what I'm about to tell you is the truest thing I know. I worked construction my whole career. Not the kind where you manage other people from a trailer with a clipboard. The kind where your knuckles split in February and you don't mention it. I framed houses, poured foundations, laid pipe in the kind of heat that makes the air above the road look like water. By the time I was 55, my knees had opinions about stairs, and my lower back let me know every morning what the weather was going to do before I ever looked out a window. I had 2 kids with my wife, Donna. Our son, Preston, came first. 18 months later, our daughter, Annie. They grew up in the same house, ate at the same table, wore clothes I worked overtime to buy. But somewhere between childhood and adulthood, they became 2 completely different kinds of people. And I don't know exactly when that happened, or what I did right with one and wrong with the other, and I've spent a lot of quiet mornings trying to figure it out. Preston was the one who was going to make it. That's how Donna always put it. Preston is going to make it, Walter. And she wasn't wrong. He was sharp, focused, ambitious, in the way that made people around him a little uncomfortable. He got a business degree from a state school on a partial scholarship. I covered the rest, and by 30 he was in commercial real estate in Atlanta, selling properties I couldn't afford to look at. By 36, he was a partner. His wife, Gretchen, was the kind of woman who made you feel underdressed in your own living room. They had a big house in a suburb I couldn't find on a map without help. They took vacations to places that required a connecting flight. Holidays, they came home to Ohio every other year, and when they did, Gretchen spent most of the visit looking at her phone, and Preston spent most of it talking about what he was building next. I was proud of him. I want to be honest about that. I was genuinely proud. I just didn't always feel like he needed me to be. Annie was different. Annie stayed close. She took 2 years of community college, then got her certification, and went to work as a home health aide, which is a job that sounds simple until you understand what it actually is. She was wiping the chins of strangers, sitting with people in the last hours of their lives, holding hands in the dark. She made $14 an hour, doing it for a long time. She drove a 10-year-old Civic with a check engine light she'd taped a small piece of electrical tape over because she said looking at it made her anxious. She lived 40 minutes from me in a rented apartment with 1 bedroom and a parking situation she described as a daily negotiation. She called me every Sunday. Every single Sunday, without fail, at 7 in the evening. She'd ask what I had for dinner, whether I'd talked to anyone that week, whether the furnace was still making that sound. Donna and I split up when Preston was 30 and Annie was 28. It wasn't dramatic. It was more like a long exhale. We'd been holding something in for years, and we just finally let it go. She moved to be closer to Preston in Atlanta. I stayed in Ohio because Ohio was where I knew how to be. After the divorce, Donna and I were civil. We were better as people who'd once been married than we ever were as people who were. She and Gretchen got along well. Preston took her side not in any declared way, but in the accumulated weight of small choices. He called her twice a week. He called me on Father's Day and my birthday and sometimes Christmas. I told myself it was fine. I was a man who learned to live around things. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday in March. I'd been tired for a while. I thought it was the kind of tired you earn after 40 years in construction, the structural kind, the kind that settles into you permanently. But it was getting worse. I was losing weight without trying. I had a cough that wouldn't leave. My primary care doctor sent me for imaging. The imaging sent me to a specialist. The specialist sat across from me in a small office with a window that looked out onto a parking garage, and he used words I'd heard before on television but never thought would be aimed at me. Lymphoma. Early stage, but needing treatment. Surgery. First to remove a mass near my collarbone. then a course of treatment after. The surgery, he explained, was time-sensitive. The mass was positioned in a way that could become complicated quickly. I drove home and sat in my car in the driveway for a while, long enough that the neighbor's dog came over to the fence and just looked at me. Then I went inside and I sat at my kitchen table and I looked at the crack in the ceiling and I did the math. My insurance, which I paid for out of pocket since I'd been semi-retired for 2 years doing part-time site consulting, had a gap. A specific, brutal gap. The surgery required a pre-certification that had come back partially denied. The hospital wanted $4,200 from me before they would schedule the operating room. My account had $1,100. I'm not a man who asks for help easily. If you've worked with your hands your whole life, if you've prided yourself on carrying your own weight, asking for help feels like admitting something you've been trying to disprove your whole career. But I was 64 years old with something growing near my collarbone that a doctor said needed to come out soon, and I did not have $4,200. So I called Preston. I want to tell you about that phone call carefully, because I've replayed it enough times that I know it the way I know certain songs, every word in the right order. He answered on the third ring. I could hear noise in the background, voices, the sound of a place that was busy and important. Dad, hey, what's up? I told him. I laid it out plainly, the way I would have explained a problem on a job site. Here is the situation. Here are the numbers. Here is what I need. There was a pause. How much did you say? $4,200, I said, or as close to it as you can manage. Another pause. Longer this time. Dad, I have to be honest with you. The timing is really bad. We just closed on a building in Buckhead. It's a significant deal, but the money's tied up in the next phase, and Gretchen and I just did a full renovation on the lake house. I said, Preston, this is surgery. This is cancer surgery. I know what it is, Dad. I'm not dismissing it. But you have insurance. Can't you appeal the denial? Can't the hospital work out a payment plan? I explained that I had tried both of those things. The appeal would take 60 to 90 days. The hospital's payment plan required the first installment before scheduling, which I also didn't have. Well, what about your savings? I explained that semi-retirement and 2 years of solo insurance premiums and a divorce settlement had done what they'd done to my savings. The pause this time felt different, flatter. Dad, I don't think I can do this right now. It's not a good time. I'm sorry. That was the sentence. It's not a good time. I sat with that for a moment. I thought about the hours I'd worked to cover his scholarship gap. I thought about the summer he was 19 and I took a second job on weekends doing deck builds so he could have a decent car for his sophomore year. I thought about all the things I'd never once categorized as a good time or a bad time. They were just things you did because someone you loved needed them. I said, Okay, Preston, I understand. And I hung up. Then I called Donna, because even after everything, she was the mother of my children, and I thought she should know. She was sympathetic. She was warm, in the careful way of someone who has already made their decision but doesn't want to announce it. Have you tried the hospital's financial assistance program? She asked. Some hospitals have funds for situations like this. I said I had looked into it. There was a wait list. Walter, I gave Preston and Gretchen money last year for the lake house renovation. I don't really have a lot of liquid right now. I'm so sorry. I really am. I thanked her for her time. I meant it, in a hollow way. I put the phone down on the kitchen table. I looked at the crack in the ceiling. The furnace rattled somewhere in the house. I was 64 years old and I was doing arithmetic in my head about whether I could get a short-term loan against my truck, which was a 12-year-old Ford F-150 with 160,000 miles on it. And I was trying to figure out if that was even possible, or if I was just looking for something to look at instead of what I was actually facing. Annie called Sunday at 7, the way she always did. I almost didn't tell her. She had nothing to spare. I knew her account balances the way you know the details of someone's life when they don't hide things from you. I knew she'd been covering her own medical bills from a wrist she'd fractured in November. I knew her rent had gone up in January. I knew she packed her lunch every day, and that she'd sold her good camera, the one she'd saved 2 years for, because she needed the money last spring. But she heard something in my voice. She always did. Dad, what's going on? It wasn't a question. It was Annie knowing. So I told her. All of it. The diagnosis, the surgery, the insurance gap, the 4,000, $200. Preston's answer. I kept my voice level. I'd had a few days to practice. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then I heard her exhale slowly, the way she did when she was thinking hard. Okay, she said. I'm going to figure this out. Don't do anything yet. I told her not to. I told her she didn't have anything to figure out because she didn't have anything to give, and I didn't want her to do anything that would hurt her. Dad, she said. And she said it in that tone she'd had since she was 9 years old. That meant the conversation had already moved past the stage where my opinion was relevant. Let me call you back. She called me back in 40 minutes. She had $3,000 from her savings, which I didn't even know she had, because she'd been quietly setting aside $40 a week for 2 years, into an account she'd once told me was her just-in-case fund. She had a friend from work who was willing to lend her $400. She'd called the hospital billing department and negotiated the remaining $800 into a 60-day deferred payment, which she put on her credit card. She had covered the entire gap. The surgery is scheduled, she said. I talked to the billing office. You're on the calendar for the 17th. I didn't say anything for a minute. Dad, are you there? I said, Annie. You didn't have to do that. I know, she said. I wanted to. That's different. She drove up the morning of the surgery. 40 minutes. At 5:30 in the morning, in her Civic with the electrical tape over the check engine light. She sat in the waiting room for 4 hours, and she was the first face I saw when I came out of recovery. She'd brought me the kind of crackers I liked and a paperback she thought I might want, and she sat next to my bed in that hospital chair that no adult has ever found comfortable, and she stayed until they told her she had to go. I want you to hold on to what I just told you, 'cause that's the part that mattered most. Not what came later, though. What came later mattered too. But that morning, in that waiting room, with her crackers and her paperback and her just-in-case savings, that was the whole story, already fully told, before anything else happened. The treatment went well. The surgery was clean. The mass was removed, and the subsequent course of treatment ran 4 months and left me tired in a way that made my old construction tired feel like a warm-up. But I got through it. Annie drove me to every appointment she could arrange around her shifts. When she couldn't, she organized a rotation of 2 neighbors and her friend from work, who I'd never met, but who showed up without complaint every time she was needed. Preston sent a card about a month after the surgery. It said, "Thinking of you," and had his and Gretchen's names at the bottom in his handwriting. I put it on the refrigerator the way you put something on the refrigerator so you don't have to decide what to do with it yet. Donna called once a month. She asked how I was feeling. I told her I was getting better. We stayed on the phone for about 10 minutes each time, before we both ran out of things to say. I was quiet that year. I had a lot of time to think, between appointments and recovery, and the long afternoons when I wasn't well enough to do much but not sick enough to sleep. I thought about what I'd built and what I'd let go without fighting for it. I thought about who had shown up and who hadn't. Here is something nobody tells you about a serious illness. It clarifies things. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way, just quietly, like a fog lifting. You see the shapes of things more plainly than you did before. I started making decisions. The first decision was the simplest. I called my attorney, a man named Gerald who'd handled my divorce paperwork and who I trusted, and I told him I wanted to redo my will. Completely. I told him what I wanted, and he listened carefully and said he could have something drafted within the week. The second decision took longer to become possible, but it became possible in a way I hadn't anticipated, and I want to tell you how it happened. Before I'd gone semi-retired, I'd spent the last active years of my construction career doing specialty work. I had an expertise in foundation repair for older industrial buildings, the kind of work most crews don't want because the structures are complicated and the liability is high. I'd built relationships over decades with a handful of engineers and inspectors in that world, and even in semi-retirement, I occasionally consulted. One of those relationships was with an engineer named Ron, who had been involved in the inspection of an old factory complex on the east side of the city, a property that had changed hands twice in the last 10 years, and was now sitting in a legal dispute between the current owners and the county over a contamination issue. Soil contamination from a buried solvent tank that the original industrial owner had abandoned in the 1980s. Ron called me 8 months after my surgery. The current owners of that property, it turned out, had been trying to establish that the contamination predated their ownership. They'd been building an evidentiary file. Ron had pointed them toward me because I'd done inspection consulting on an adjacent property 15 years ago and had documentation, my own field notes, and photographs that established the solvent tank's presence and condition at that time, which helped them make their case. The owners settled with the county for a significant sum and, as part of that settlement, the attorneys handling the remediation trust had established a fund to compensate parties who had provided material documentation supporting the case. It was a legal mechanism I'd never encountered before and wouldn't have understood without Gerald explaining it to me twice. My documentation was considered material. The compensation, after Gerald's fees, came to just over $380,000. I want to be honest about something. That number is not $12 million. It is not a lottery. It is not a Hollywood ending. It is $380,000, which to a 64-year-old, semi-retired man living in a house with a crack in the ceiling is a completely transformative amount of money. Because it is enough. It is more than enough. And sometimes enough is the thing you spent your whole life working toward without quite knowing the word for it. The first thing I did was pay Annie back. Every dollar with interest I calculated myself, which she refused, and I added anyway. The second thing I did was work with Gerald to establish an irrevocable trust. He explained the word irrevocable very carefully because he knows I like to understand what I'm agreeing to. Once it's done, it cannot be undone. Not by me, not by a court, not by anyone presenting themselves as my next of kin with a lawyer of their own. The primary beneficiary was Annie. The trust covered her student debt, what was left of it, and established a fund for a house, which she had been unable to afford and had stopped letting herself want. I also bought myself a decent used truck, newer than the F-150, no tape over any warning lights. Preston found out the way these things tend to come out through Donna, who I had told because she was the mother of my children, and I believed she deserved to know I was financially stable. I didn't ask her to keep it private. I suppose I expected she would understand the situation without me drawing her a map. I was wrong about that. Preston called me on a Thursday evening. He was in a good mood, which I recognized as the specific good mood of someone who has already decided how a conversation is going to go. "Dad, I heard some news." I said I thought he might have. "That's incredible. That kind of thing just doesn't happen to most people. Ron must have really gone to bat for you." He paused. "I have to say, I feel terrible about how things went last year. The timing was it was a really complicated period for us, and I didn't handle it well. I know that." I let the apology sit there for a moment. I thought about whether it was real. I'm still not entirely sure. What I am sure of is that it arrived after he'd heard the number, not before. "I'd really love to get together soon," he said. "Gretchen and I were actually talking about coming up in the fall, and I want to make things right between us, Dad. Family is everything. Family is everything." I said, "Preston, I'd like to ask you something." "Sure. If you'd heard last year that my surgery went wrong, that I didn't make it, would you have said, 'Family is everything' at my funeral?" He didn't answer right away. I said, "I'm not asking to be cruel. I'm asking because I'd like to understand you. Because I'm your father, and I've been trying to understand you for 37 years. Dad, that's not fair." I said, "Maybe it isn't. I'm 64 years old, and I had cancer surgery that I couldn't afford, and you told me it wasn't a good time. I'm not angry about it anymore. But I want you to know that I heard you. And I've made decisions based on what I heard." The mood on the phone changed. The warmth went out of it like a window being closed. "What kind of decisions?" I told him that my estate was in order, that everything had been handled, that Gerald could provide him with whatever documentation he was entitled to as a matter of law, which in the state of Ohio means a copy of the will upon my passing, at which point the contents of the trust are not subject to legal challenge, because that is the nature of an irrevocable trust. There was a silence on the phone that I can only describe as the sound of a man recalculating. "So you're cutting me out," I said. "I'm not cutting you out of my life. You're my son. I'll always be your father. I'm not cutting you out of holidays or phone calls or whatever relationship we're capable of having. But I've decided what I'm doing with what I have. And I've decided based on what I know, which is who was in that waiting room and who sent a card." He said some things after that. Some of them were angry, and some of them were wounded, and some of them were both at once. I let him say them. When he was done, I told him I loved him, and I hoped we could find our way to something real between us before one of us ran out of time to do it. Then I said goodnight, and I ended the call. Annie doesn't know the full amount in the trust. I told her there was something set up for her, something secure, and she cried and told me to stop, and then she cried more and told me I didn't have to do that. I said, I know I didn't have to. That's different. She laughed when I said that. She recognized her own words. Last month, she put in an offer on a small house in her neighborhood, 2 bedrooms, a yard with a fence, close enough to her job that she could walk on nice days. The offer was accepted. She closes next month. I drove over to see the place from the outside. She didn't know I was going. I just wanted to see it. I parked across the street and looked at it for a while. It's a good house. Solid. The kind of thing that's been there for decades and plans to stay. The yard needs some work. I already know what I'm going to bring when I come to help her with it. I have a lot of tools. Good ones. Built up over 40 years. And I have time now, real time. Not the kind you're always behind on. I have mornings and weekends, and the particular freedom of a man who made it through something he wasn't sure he'd make it through, and who came out the other side knowing exactly who had been standing next to him. There are people in your life right now who would sell their good camera for you without telling you that's what they were doing. There are people who would give you their just-in-case money and call it wanting to rather than having to. Pay attention to those people. Take them seriously. Don't wait for a crack in the ceiling to remind you that some things shouldn't keep waiting. I still haven't fixed the one in my kitchen. But these days, when I sit down with my coffee and I look at it, I don't think about all the things I never got around to. I think about a waiting room at 6 in the morning, and a bag of crackers, and a paperback, and a daughter who drove 40 minutes in the dark, because that is what love actually looks like when it isn't waiting for the right time. That's all I've got for you today, friends. If this story reached something in you, if it made you think of someone in your own life, tell them, don't wait. I'll see you in the next one.